Welcome back. We're going to draw Willem Dafoe today. The famous actor in a three-quarter view. This is a pretty formal headshot portrait. And we are going to start with thinking about his cranium, which is almost a circle in this view. It's just a little bit wider than it is tall because of the turn of his head. Sorry about the focus there. Okay. And we're going to drop the face down from the right edge of the cranium, and we're going to look for the other side of the face, which is roughly where the shadow break is, at about a third of the way across, with the jaw coming behind it. So we end up with a very simplified kind of schematic of a three-quarter view head to begin with. The goal here is to start thinking of what we're looking at as a volume instead of thinking of it as a two-dimensional form. So I'm throwing the little neck in here. The neck's coming from around the middle of the chin, a little to the left of center of the chin. And it can be really helpful to throw the ear in there earlier rather than later, because the ear gives your brain a lot of clues about which way the head is turned. So we'll just pop the ear in here at the top of the jaw, right behind the jawline. And having done all that, we're about to start measuring. Just to make sure this head is planted correctly on the neck, we're going to look at the line of the shoulder and kind of see where it lands. If we extend it, you see how it's kind of aiming up towards the brow ridge on the right, on our right, and it just goes right under the earlobe, ends around the brow ridge. So it can be very helpful to sort of plant the head on the neck correctly before you do all the features. Just have a better sense of which way it's turned and how it's being supported, which are both really important factors. Now we're going to take our minimal measurements. First and most important thing to get right is the line of the eyes. And if I go right through the pupils, you'll notice that this line slopes down to the right just a little. The line of the chin slopes up just a little. And if we could see the top of the head, that would be converging with these other two lines. This, as you'll remember, these are perspective issues. Can you feel how it feels like we're looking up slightly at his head? So because of that, this line is tilting down a little. If you tilt this line the wrong way, like a lot of you might if you weren't thinking about it, or if you made it straight, you would lose that sense of that we're looking up at his head. And I notice that it is exactly centered on his face, the eye line. So we're going to just give ourselves some perspective clues here that are going to help us as we move forward. He obviously has a pretty massive chin and jaw. But he also has a pretty massive forehead and cranium. So his basically has kind of a long face, but his eyes are centered on it. And if you doubt that, you can measure it for yourself, as I'm doing right now, and you're going to find the eyes are just about exactly centered. Of course, I'm guessing where the top of the head is. You know, the hair, his hair extends above that, but we're going to call that centered. The other thing I like to measure is where's the center of the head. So center of the face goes through this bridge of the nose here. And so we've got one unit to the right of it, and we've got another unit to the left of it. And what you've learned from the mistakes that you've made in the past, what I know from watching students draw for many years, is most of you are going to want to put that center line of the face too close to the center line of the head. Like you're gonna want to bump that nose towards the middle, and then when you start drawing everything, you'll be really confused that you end up with so much extra space around this eye. So this is a really useful thing to measure. I'm going to measure it visually with my pencil. You can check it for yourself. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3. This is about a quarter of the way over. Little more than a quarter. See, if I take this unit and repeat it, that gets me to here. If I repeat it again, it gets me to here. And this is a little less than a fourth unit towards the back of the head. Is everyone following what I just did? So if we go just a little left of center here, that's going to be our second unit. And then if we divide this in half, that's going to be our first unit. And then we're going to pop another unit here, and we'll have a little less than 1 unit at the end. So what we just found was where to put the bridge of the nose, which is going to be just a little, this wrinkle is just a little bit above eye line, and it's at this mark. So having found that, I'm going to mix things up a little and just I'm going to start doing some shadow mapping before I measure anything else. So let's just throw in a little shadow to the right of the bridge of the nose, and another shadow to the left of the bridge of the nose. We're sort of building around these eye sockets. Remember, if you're right-handed, you're shading the opposite way from what you see me doing. And then we have this wonderfully clear lighting. We're going to shadow map along the edge of the forehead, around the cheekbone. I'm going to do one more measurement to make things a little easier. We're going to measure. So we've got the eyebrows here, nose here, chin. The nose is indeed halfway down between the eyebrows and the bottom of the chin. So if we know where the brow ridge is up here, we know where the chin is, so we know this is going to be in the middle, about halfway. So we can just block in get a general sense of where the nose is going to be. That allows us to place a little shadow under the nose, and then I can And continue with this cheekbone shadow. And come around the corner and shade the bottom edge of the chin. Notice everything to the left of this shadow edge is in shadow, including all the hair back here. So I'm going to go ahead, again, you're shading the other way if you're right-handed, but I'm going to just throw a tone over all this. And I know I say this a lot, but the goal here is you're tricking your brain. You see how much more, as soon as we do that, this looks like a volume. And the analogy I'm going to use again and again is sculpture. If we were sculpting this head, this is how we would start. We'd start out with a block of clay, and we would cut the major planes out. We'd shape it crudely and put it crudely into shape, and then we'd start punching out eye sockets. We'd bring out the nose a little. We'd be forming a volume and that approximates the form of his head. And only then would we start to think about individual features and sculpting the individual features, which we're about to do. I'm going to go ahead, and we know the hair goes up to about here. So I'm going to go ahead, and this is in shadow here because he's got this very volumetric hair, which is blocking the light. And I'm also going to just put in a very general shadow shape for his upper lip, which is, as we would expect, about a third of the way down between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin. Notice I'm just shading it very loosely. I'm going to put in just a hint of these creases as well, and just a little hint of the shadow under his eyes, his lower eyelids. And the last thing I'm going to do is shade his irises. Remember, we're thinking of irises as shadows. And having done the irises, we can begin to check for the overall proportions of the head and the gaze, like which way is he looking. There's a little hint of a shadow under his bottom lip. His bottom lip's very flat, though. You see it doesn't really project out, so this shadow's a little lower down than it normally would be. So it's very important that you pause at this stage of the drawing to see if you're getting a likeness. Because remember, your ability to assess a likeness occurs on two sides of your brain, your left brain and your right brain. Right now, there aren't any details, so your left brain has nothing to go on. And so you're assessing this likeness based entirely on your, oh, I messed up, didn't I? It's your, yeah, you're entirely on your right brain. Your right brain is assessing likeness. Your right brain assesses the likeness based on the overall relationship between the features, or another way of thinking about it is a very rough pattern of lights and darks. That's why you'd be able to recognize Willem Dafoe on a foggy day from 50 yards away. You'd be like, isn't that Willem Dafoe over there? Because your brain would catch this pattern of lights and darks. And in the same way, looking at your drawing right now, you should be able to recognize ways that your drawing does not look like Willem Dafoe. I'm reading just a slight extra length in my nose, so I'm just going to build this shadow form a little bit higher. And you'll be reading different things in your drawings, but you see what I just did? I just subtly shortened the nose. I'm going to lift this shadow shape a little bit. Okay, we're going to start to take a look at Willem's actual features now, which are very distinctive. This isn't the best quality photograph, but so our anchor here is this crease. And we're going to work around that, and we're going to draw the actual bridge of the nose. We're going to commit to this now. He's got a little bit of a, you can see it's not a straight, not exactly a straight nose. It sort of slopes forward to about here, and then it dives a little more steeply down to about here, and then this contour disappears and we see the contour of the ala on the receding side, which is a very slight curve, very shallow curve because it's so foreshortened. His nostrils are very open, giving him a little slightly flared look to the nostrils. So we're going to shade that. And the tip of his nose is not a little smile curve like we normally see. It's very straight, and it angles down a little to the left. And then it flows into this gigantic nostril on the left side. And it's helpful that we sort of indicated where these folds are. That's helping me place the nostrils correctly. And now the ala comes sharply up and over sort of like that. Now, it's easy to forget that the tip of the nose is almost always in shadow at the bottom. So I'm going to shadow map that. And then this shadow edge comes up away from the tip of the nose. It's very important to remember that the shapes of your shadow edges are just as important as the contours themselves. They're just as descriptive of the form, and you don't want to slack off and be lazy when you're doing that part. So I'm shadow mapping and making a lot of revisions to my initial guess. And then I'm going to do a more clear and definite first shading, staying exactly inside this shadow map. And finally, I'm going to do a little bit of cross contour shading across the shadow edge here to create the roundness of the tip of his nose. And do the same thing along here. And there's just, this is a half, like almost half tone, but there's a little bit of shadow right above the ala. Not quite as dark as our other shadows. And then a strong, clear halftone along the side of the nose here. And that pretty much does it for the nose. Okay, so now we're really locked in on the bridge of the nose here. We're going to look very carefully at where this eyelid intersects it. So it's right about here is where the eyelid is just grazing that bridge of the nose. Now remember, eyes are not all the same. That's why when Willem Dafoe goes out to lunch, he wears his dark sunglasses, and few people recognize him. So we're going to pay a lot of attention to the shape of the eye, which is actually the shape of the eyelid. Remember, our eyes are all pretty much the same, but it's the eye formation of the eyelids around the eyes that are unique. And what we're looking for is how close to the, we already know about where the edge of the face is going to be. We measured that. And we're going to notice that the eyelid stops about 2/3 of the way over between the bridge of the nose and the edge of the face. And we're going to pay special attention to this surface that reveals itself, the inside of his eyelid right here. Don't neglect that. And notice we went almost straight and then we dove sharply down. And then the eyelid terminates in sort of a crow's foot, a couple little creases. And the lower lid goes almost straight across. So notice this shape is really nothing like a football. So if you're still making football eyes or almond eyes, that's not what we're looking at. This is more like the profile of an airplane wing. You see that? It's like flat across the bottom, curves across the top. Then we're going to look at these shark tooth shapes on either side of the iris. There's this one, and then there's a small triangle on this side. Those are the negative spaces around the iris. If you get those right, the iris is going to draw itself. And you'll avoid most of the errors that people make when drawing irises. Please notice that the pupil is way up near the top of the iris, almost disappearing under the lid. If you put the pupil in the center of the iris, it's going to look really weird. So put it way up here. Leave that little notch cut out of it for the highlight. And notice that the iris gets darker when it goes up, passes under the lid, because the lid is actually casting a shadow onto the iris. And if you don't put that shadow in, it's going to look like the eyes are bulging out of the head. And finally, the eyebrow is about as wide as the eye itself on this guy, so we're going to do a little shading for that and a little shading around the eye socket. This is a halftone here, but an important plane change between the form of the eye socket and this kind of fullness on either side of the nose. And as long as we're over here, let's go ahead and define the cheekbone a little bit more. So we've got this curve for the eye socket. Then the forehead, edge of the forehead goes just straight up. The cheekbone, we might want to ask ourselves, where does this form peak? The peak of this curve is just a little higher than where the alas are, so the peak should be about here. And it comes out beyond the curve of the brow ridge. You see that? Just a little, projects out a little further than the brow ridge and peaks about here. And the form ends, this curve ends just a little bit below the tip of the nose, so that's about here. And the habit I'm trying to encourage is you're always relating forms that you've drawn to forms that you're relating forms you haven't drawn to the things you've already established, which is not as, it's common sense, but a lot of people are not in the habit of doing that. Okay, as we define this fold a little more specifically, we're going to notice that it runs at about 45 or 50 degrees, and it disappears right behind the ala on this side. And it's really helpful to remember that contours of the human head and body are nearly all convex. So this curves out, this curves out, this curves out. And what we're looking for are where the intersections of the curves are. So we already established there's an intersection here. Next intersection happens about halfway down the chin, like that. And the final curve is the curve of the chin itself. And that chin projects out. The mass of the chin, I think I don't have it, it's not quite square enough in my drawing. So yeah, I'm feeling like my chin needs to project just a little more to the right. He has a very strong chin, which I sort of downplayed in my initial planning for this drawing. And notice that this little pocket of shadow of the corner of the mouth is sort of lined up with this outside curve of the chin, or just inside it. And if we analyze the curves of the mouth, he has a very wide central curve. This curve, remember, is going away from us, so it's foreshortened. And this is much longer because it's turned towards us. So the main thing to focus on is that, number one, this section in the middle is very wide on him. You can see he also has a very wide philtrum. But this section here is about half as long as this section here. So I'm gonna start by sketching where the philtrum goes. And then I'm gonna place this center curve under the philtrum. And then I'm going to make sure that this little section here is really short, and this one here is about twice as long. And it kind of swoops down and then back up just a little at the corner. Another way to check your work is to look for this angle between the ala and the corner of the mouth. Like, just make sure this is about, what would you say, 80 degrees, 75 degrees from horizontal. And having defined the line between the lips, we can now do a little more detailed shading of the upper lip. Notice it gets darker towards the corners. So the lips tend to be flatter in the middle, and so they get less shadow right in the middle of the lip. And there's another little pocket of shadow at this corner of the mouth. And just a little dark halftone along the bottom edge of the lip here. But don't you dare make a hard line across here, because there is not anything like that. And we've got a little pocket of shadow right here towards the left-hand edge of this halftone. And in this photograph, the jawline really sort of disappears. I'm going to cheat in just a little reflected light along this bottom edge I'm going to bring it out a little more than I see it in the photograph. And now we're getting into another really specific contour. The cragginess of his face has a lot to do with the fact that this shadow edge here is so irregular. You see that? So we're going to try to do that justice. Those ups and downs of this shadow edge account for what we might call the texture of his face. And there's a lot of areas here that are sort of halfway between shadow and halftone. If you really want to get that texture, there's a little piece of light next to this little shadow accent. That's how you show the crease in his face. And I'm going to get a little more definite with this form now. Because he's pretty old, we're allowed to draw this line the way it moves. On a younger person, we would indicate it with little cross hatches, but he actually does have an actual crease there, so that's what we're going to draw. And here's another sort of a textural thing, which is a little dark accent under the cheekbone here, just a little lower than the top of the nostril over here, and halftone all around, and then pick up just a little piece of light under that dimple. And having established a little bit of the cragginess and the texture, we can go ahead and just simplify this area to the left of it. I'm going to go over it with another first shading. We're not photorealists, so we're not committed to capturing every nuance of this photograph. That's what photographs are for. We're trying to simplify this a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and pass one more tone over the neck. Okay, we're going to draw that other eye now. Double check, make sure you've got your eye line at this eye. Make sure this eye ends up a little higher than the one on the right. And then we're going to start with a more detailed shadow map of this eye socket. So we're going to go a little darker inside this eye socket. If you're happy with the way you placed the ala on the right, on the left, you can use that as a reference for the corner of the eye. So let's see where we end up. Yep, if we pull straight up from the ala, that's going to tell us where to put the corner of the eye. And again, just a little higher than the corner on the other side. And then the shape of the eye is going to angle up at about 45 degrees till it gets to here, and then it's going to angle almost, it makes a sharp corner and then comes down like that. We're seeing a little less of the inside of the eyelid on this side because this eye is facing us. This one's turning away. So more of this surface shows on this side. And this lid is just a little heavier overall than the lid on the right. And those asymmetries are very important to recognize. They contribute to the likeness a lot. So this eyelid is fuller and heavier than this one. The lower margin of the lid, we have to be really careful not to make a dark line here. It goes almost straight across, but we're going to indicate it very faintly because he doesn't have really visible lower eyelashes, and the plane change here is, light against light, so it doesn't show up much. And here again is a little tiny shark tooth on the left and a larger shark tooth on the right. And look at that. Just pay attention to the size of those shark teeth and your gaze is going to take care of itself. It really feels like the eyes are focused. They're looking the same direction. There's that pupil almost going up under the lid. And notice that the iris is a little darker on the right and under the lid. There's a lightening to the iris right here. Because the iris, remember, is an inverted cone. So it's catching the light on the underside instead of on the top. Okay, we can shade darker above the eyelid now that we've committed to that form. And we can extend up a little bit, suggest the eyebrow up here. And the crow's feet towards the outside. And this little tiny piece of shadow inside this halftone for the lower lid. And a little halftone under here for the margin of the eye socket. And that leaves us with this highlight along the cheekbone. Okay, it's time to back out a little, see how we're doing, and see what we still have left. We only have about 5 or 10 minutes left to finish this, so somehow I neglected this little crease, this little furrow between the brows. I'm going to suggest with some very light lines these creases on his forehead. And we have here we've got a shadow that's cast onto the forehead from the hair. I'm basically happy with my ear placement. Let's darken the sideburn in between the ear and the cheekbone. And the ear details, if you're familiar with the forms of the ear, that's going to be really simple. Especially there's no light there, it's just shadow on shadow. So we've got the form of the helix curving up and around, getting thinner towards the back. Form of the tragus. The antitragus, and then the antihelix curving up around behind the helix. And that's an ear in 60 seconds or less. I think I showed you a couple of clips from an artist, a YouTube artist named Dylan, who seems weirdly proud of the fact that he spends hundreds of hours on his drawings. And I'm a lot more interested to see artists who can take complex information and understand it so well that they can represent it in a few minutes rather than a few days. The more time you spend copying a photograph, the less understanding your drawing requires, if that makes sense to you. Your inkjet printer doesn't understand the photograph at all. It just represents every point and every value in its proper place. And extremely patient humans can do the same thing, but at the sacrifice of really revealing anything about the way they see the world or even the way they see that photograph. I'm going to go dark right here with my first shading direction again because I'm in a hurry. It's important not to neglect the value changes in the hair. You don't have to copy everything exactly, but you do want to give a sense that some of the hair is turning towards the light, like up here, and some patches in through here. And other large areas of the hair, like this and this, are turning away from the light. And remember that hair is usually quite a bit shinier than skin, and so you want the value differences in the hair to be more slightly exaggerated compared to the value differences in the skin. And most beginners make the opposite mistake. They exaggerate the value changes in the skin, and then they make the hair all the same color. Sort of like if they were coloring it in a coloring book. And that makes that flattens out the entire form of the head if you make that mistake. So you want to avoid that. So that's Willem Dafoe. Willem, if you're watching, I would be happy to give you this drawing, although the work is really, the creative work here, everyone should understand, is mainly the work of this photographer and not my own. Which is why if you're doing a portfolio piece, you should always take your own photographs. Thanks at home for watching. That'll do it for today.